So, so thanks for inviting me on, Yaron. This is really exciting.
Good. Yeah, this should be fun.
Yeah.
We're live in like 30 seconds, I think.
All right.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Sunday, Mother's Day. What are you guys doing listening to me on Mother's Day? What is Adam doing here? Adam has a story about Mother's Day. His wife won't let him celebrate. So, Adam, thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's see. So, guys, today we're going to talk IP, patents, copyrights, any issues regarding intellectual property. If there are libertarians in the audience right now and you have questions or concerns or disagreements about intellectual property, don't wait to debate me on the topic. Adam's the guy. So I'm eager to ask him any questions you have to challenge the whole idea of intellectual property, to challenge the whole idea of copyrights and patents. This is your opportunity. Wait a minute. Lights. I forgot to do the lights. This will make me look much better. All right, sorry about that. So yes, don't forget to do that. Of course, don't forget to like the show before you leave. Of course, if you like it, assuming you do. And if you want to comment, if you want to ask questions, if you want to challenge Adam on any of these issues, then use the super chat feature, and we will address all those issues. So yes, it's rare that we have a world expert. I mean, really a world expert on a particular topic, although no, all the people we have on are world experts on their topic. But on IP, Adam is the guy. I don't know anybody else who knows more about IP than he does. So he is a quick bio. He is a professor of law at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He's published extensively about patents, copyrights, and other intellectual property rights in defense of them. He has appeared, or put it this way, his scholarship has been relied upon by the Supreme Court, not enough in my view, by lower federal courts, by federal agencies. I've seen him testify. I think I've seen video of him testifying in front of Congress, both Senate and House of Representatives, on IP issues. And he has written not only in academic journals and law journals, you can Google those, but also in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Forbes, Investors Business Daily, and many other outlets. So it's a real treat to have him on. And again, any questions that have always been going through your mind about IP, kind of borderline cases, or just challenging the whole doctrine, today is really your opportunity to do that. We've got somebody here who says that you are his 1L property professor.
Oh, wow, awesome.
So, you know, the circle, it's a small world.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really delighted to hear that. You have a fan that was one of my students.
Alex, did you become a fan of good ideas because of the class? That's one of those. So Adam, thanks for joining us. Of course, what's in the news right now is the Trump administration, and really support from most of Europe, although surprisingly not from Germany, which is kind of cool, about this idea of that, you know, there's a global epidemic, it's a crisis. India and I guess South Africa have large generic manufacturing capabilities. Why not just forget about, you know, patents just in this one case and let them ramp up production so that we can avoid massive death in these two countries. So is it kind of this altruistic motivation that is motivating this, or is this something bigger?
Oh, I mean, certainly one of the foundational ideas is, of course, we need these vaccines. You've produced them, and therefore we should get them in any way, shape, or form and have access to them. But I just want to state at the outset, I mean, the entire premise of this proposal, which was first submitted to the World Trade Organization back in September by India and South Africa. And this is not the first time that there have been proposed waivers of protections under our international treaties. They tried to do so multiple times under TRIPS for the AIDS epidemic back in the 90s and turn of the century. There is zero, and I just want to emphasize that, zero evidence that patents have blockaded, hindered, or otherwise prevented anyone from getting the vaccine. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's that patents have been the launching pad, the platform for the fact that in historically unprecedented time, I mean, and just massive mobilization of resources. I mean, we have within less than a year, multiple vaccines for a novel virus. It just never has happened before in human history. And we had the patent system to thank for that.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's stunning. The one of the great achievements ever in many regards. Scientifically, it builds upon achievements of many decades.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 days it took Moderna to put together the model of vaccine.
Yeah.
By the way, I guess I said earlier that it was the Trump administration. No, it's the Biden administration. I apologize. Everything bad in my mind, as you guys know, because I have Trump derangement syndrome, is associated with Trump. But no, it turns out Biden is just as bad or worse. Well, in some regards, and better in some other regards. But yes, it's the Biden administration. Actually, you said the Trump administration, one of the good things they did is they opposed this when it came out.
Yes.
So,
and by the way, you mentioned Moderna. Everyone knows that. So the what we now call the Pfizer vaccine, which was actually invented by BioNTech in Germany through a commercial agreement between BioNTech and Pfizer. Do you know how long it took them to make their vaccine using mRNA technology? 2 hours.
2 hours. Wow.
2 hours.
Yep.
So the FDA had submitted to them the virus for testing in February of 2020. Yep. We had this vaccine ready to go, and if people were left free to say, yeah, try it on me, we could have had people treated for this disease a year before the vaccine was actually distributed to patients. And it wasn't because of patents; it was because of the blockade at the FDA.
And it wasn't because of safety, because the safety trials were done by, I think, the end of May. So by May, we had safety done, phase 1 done. And now it's just a question of efficacy. But why not take the vaccine? It's free, right? The government's paying for it all. Why not take the vaccine if it's safe? And the only question is efficaciousness. Take it. What the hell? And let's see, right? We could have had a trial, a phase 3 on millions of people.
Yeah.
Instead of waiting until December to start it. And even now, we still don't have AstraZeneca in the United States. We still don't have. There's one other. There's one other. JJ was approved late. The whole thing is just.
It's a mess.
Good and ridiculous. Okay, so it's the patent system to some extent, right? Because it motivated these. The profit motive is backed by the patent system, which motivated them to go into production and to go into innovating. And 120 different countries try to create a vaccine. Different companies try to create the vaccine. So all of this happened because of a patent system. But the argument is, isn't it the case that all of this science is really funded by public money, right? By the US government doing basic research? And isn't this a way to get a return on investment? Shouldn't the government have access to it, to be able to play around with these patents? Because ultimately it's all based on science produced by government funds.
Yeah, and one hears that all the time. When I tweeted my criticism of the Biden administration, I got, in addition to being called a ghoul and all sorts of things, people said this all the time. Oh, the government paid for this anyway, so these companies don't have a right to it. And it's false factually. But there's a kernel of truth that yes, there is public funding of medical research, right? And that's what's being leveraged to push this really false claim. even in this particular case, Pfizer said they accepted zero money, even from Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, they took the money for distribution, but not for development.
Yeah. And so, and Moderna took a teeny bit of money decades ago years and years ago from DARPA that constituted a couple percent of its total R&D that it was investing. And in fact, last August, there were all these articles about how, well, yes, the Defense Department is investigating whether it should claim ownership in the patents that Moderna has, developed in this instance. And then we didn't hear anything, because we all know what the result of that investigation was, which is that they didn't actually provide any significant research. So let me address first the empirical point, the kind of the false empirical point about, the government just funds this all. And the reason why people think this is because the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, does provide approximately $30 billion a year in funding for life sciences research. It's the largest single entity funder in the world for this. But that is peanuts compared to the private sector investments that are made. The last numbers we have are for 2019 or 2018, and in 2018, total private sector investments in R&D in the biopharmaceutical industry were $140 billion. So you have, by a factor of 4 to 1, a difference in the amount of funding that's being provided. Now, more importantly, even also the funding that NIH is doing is very far upstream funding. And so it's the researchers in at universities who are like investigating really kind of very theoretical, very early stage type stuff. 99% of that has zero impact and zero produces anything in the real world. And just to give people a sense of this, of the reality of this. So for every single therapeutic drug that is eventually approved by the FDA for patients to take in the market, that represents 10,000 molecules upstream that were originally investigated to treat the condition that drug is being now approved to treat. And this is why the average amount of R&D spent by companies behind it before they sell even that single pill is estimated at $2.6 billion and takes approximately 10 to 15 years. And so just like with Obama, you didn't build that, right? Because we funded the roads and we funded the schools and we funded all of the infrastructure that made you business persons capable of being innovators, which is all false. You have the same thing being said here, that this kind of far upstream, pure research type of funding that's being done by the NIH, which is relatively small amounts compared to what is happening in the private, because that $140 billion by the private sector is actually going to real world development of real world drugs too, is being leveraged to create this total myth that the government just creates all of this, which is just false.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they do is they take whatever drug comes out in the end, and they can draw a line to some basic research that happened that was funded by the NIH. Ignoring 100 other things that were funded by NIH that went nowhere, right?
Yes, right. Well, and also it's just like, this is the problem in law. Like, you can causally connect anyone's actions to someone being injured somewhere, right? A butterfly flaps its wings in the Middle East, and there's a hurricane in Hawaii. And so in law, we established the requirement that no, there has to be some reasonable foreseeability and some reasonable connection between some person's actions and legal liability. And this has to be established in this instance. I got involved in a big dust up over remdesivir. I always have trouble pronouncing that drug. Which was the first drug that was approved to treat severe respiratory ailments caused by COVID-19 infections. And immediately there were calls for the government to take over and engage in what's called compulsory licensing, which is licensing without the authorization of Gilead, the patent owner, in it, because allegedly the government funded this, which is totally false. So remdesivir was originally actually investigated to treat Ebola. It didn't actually work, and so they shelved it. And then when COVID happened, they said, well, this respiratory type conditions that we're seeing are similar, so let's see if it works against COVID. And it did. Now what they did get was after they had developed the drug, the Army provided some funding for research in Africa to see if it worked in Africa. after the drug was developed. But the US government provided zero funds to actually create this drug. Gilead spent over $1 billion developing this drug.
Yep.
And yet you had people saying, oh, the Army spent all this money on it, therefore the federal government did this, so therefore they should take it over. It's just totally false. And this was confirmed actually eventually by Government Accountability Office report in February 2020 or 2021, where they said the government provided zero funds to the creation of this drug. I mean, but everyone still thinks to this day, oh yeah, no, the government created it. It's a smear on the scientists at Gilead too, who actually engaged in all of that productive labor and effort and energy and innovation to create this drug.
But this is what happens when the government, because the government is in every aspect of our life, they start getting away with that. They start, we built the roads, we built this, so you owe us. So, and who's we exactly? I always say, what comes first? This is one where for the audio, what comes first? The taxes come first or the production comes first?
Yeah.
Right. The roads come first or the producers from which you steal the money to build the roads come first? Right. So even if you want to play that game, you can't build the road without taxes. And the taxes have to be taken from somebody who produced something to build the road. So it's really producers build the roads. They fund the science, they fund everything because the government is just redistributing somebody else as well.
And it's another great example of how, government controls and projects breed more government controls and projects. It's a tremendous example in this context. It just never stops.
So I've got a couple of questions about this on the chat. Why did the FDA delay the vaccines? Was it in order to delay it until after the election?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a little, I have to say, it was a little suspicious when the drug companies announced the results of their phase 3 trials about 2 weeks after the election. Actually the FDA actually, by FDA standards, it didn't delay at all. I mean, usually it takes the FDA years. One of the reasons why it takes 10 to 15 years is because they're run through the ringer on these 4 stages of testing at the FDA. Because, these government officials, it's all the wrong incentives, right? They're totally blamed if something goes wrong and they don't get any credit for the right stuff. And so, if, one thing is wrong, then they're going to hold it up. And they usually do for years and years and years, which is the typical story of all government regulatory agencies. And so it was actually to have a 11-month or 10-month approval process at the FDA is like rocket fast. That's like rocket docket in a lawsuit. And that but that was still 10 months of unnecessary testing because frankly, if we should have just left it to it's your body, right? It's your life. If you want to be tested for the vaccine, you should be allowed to make that decision.
Yeah, we could have had
harming anyone and allowing yourself to be.
Sure, we could have had it,
and especially for the people who are actually high risk. The actual high risk people, the people 60 in age and up, who have other conditions. I mean, they should have just been given the choice.
Yeah, and we also had they wouldn't do challenge trials where they give in a sense they expose young people to COVID. They vaccinate them, then they expose them to COVID and see what happens. Young people, who don't suffer dramatically from COVID, and volunteers, obviously, and they wouldn't do that to speed it up. So they would rather see hundreds of thousands of people die than get a few young people sick who've chosen voluntarily to do it, to speed this up. But that's the FDA. It has nothing to, it has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with this government agency that forever has held up everything. I mean, not just these vaccines, but they held up cancer treatments in horrible, horrific ways. So what do you think is going to happen with the vaccines? I mean, with Germany objecting, can they actually get this through?
Yeah. So it's not immediately, but everyone is expected to eventually fold now that the United States has endorsed it. I mean, this is a huge development. The United States has never in the entire history of this process under what's called TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, this international treaty that of which this is all occurring under at the World Trade Organization, has never supported a push for waivers of the requirements that countries respect other countries' intellectual property rights. And so it is a tremendous development, a really horrendously bad development. And what's expected now is that the other countries in the G7 countries have typically opposed these types of waivers in the past, especially Switzerland, England, Germany.
Yep.
Switzerland and England also still oppose this. Germany came out vocally, but I've heard that Switzerland and England are still opposing to it. But everyone's expected eventually to fold now that the United States has, because we've been the leading country for decades for patent protections and for biotech. This is one of the reasons why the biotech revolution has happened in the United States. We were the very first country to provide patent protections in 1980, starting in 1980 for biotech innovations. And so now that we folded, everyone else is expected to fall in line. This will take some time. This is another reason why, like, I want to emphasize, like, this had nothing to do about patents. This was a pre-existing anti-intellectual property agenda. They took advantage of a crisis. Rahm Emanuel's very famous statement, never let a crisis go to waste. It allows you to do things you weren't allowed to get away with before. And that he said it's, during the Great Recession in 2008. And for those who don't remember, Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff for President Obama. Yep. And so they were just using this crisis. They've always used crises as excuses to push for this. Now, there isn't even language yet. There isn't even official language for them to talk about, like, what will be the scope of this waiver and how will it be applied, and then it has to be implemented by various countries. So nothing probably will happen practically until the fall or early winter at the end of 2021, which is another reason why people were saying, like, this was totally unnecessary, because current estimates right now of the total number of doses that will be available by the end of 2021 range from 15 to 20 billion.
Yeah. I
mean, there's only 8.5 billion people on the planet.
I know.
I mean, there's just so this is just total political move to attack and undermine patent rights.
And does Congress have to approve it, or is this within the executive's authority?
No, so every country would have to implement this under their laws, and as to the, so to the extent you have an authoritarian regime like China, they can just implement it however they choose. The United States, it would have to be implemented through legislation enacted by Congress. But it's definitely going to be adopted here, because it would be a little weird for the Biden administration to say, we support this waiver, and then not push for the waiver actually to be implemented in the United States, even though, by the way, this is not about the United States. This is really about India and South Africa and other countries wanting free access. By the way, and it's not even really a patents. The waiver is not limited to patents. It's all IP. It's copyrights, it's trade secrets. And actually the trade secrets is the really important part. It's the know-how. This is what everyone is now saying. Now that they succeeded in getting the US to support this, they're all saying, oh yeah, well, what we really have to have is forced tech transfer. It's called tech transfer when you shift technical know-how from one country to another. They're saying we have to have actually forced tech transfer, because it's actually, the real difficulty here is not the patents on the mRNA technology. It's actually creating the facilities and getting the raw materials and having the skilled workforce and having the people being able to work with what is really difficult cutting edge technology in a mass manufacturing capacity and producing efficacious, high quality vaccines that work. And so even if this happened tomorrow, for instance, like the WTO instituted it, nothing would happen for still until the end of 2021, because no one has the manufacturing capabilities to do this.
Well, my guess is right now, I think this is probably true, that Pfizer and Moderna and others are probably teaming up with Indian manufacturers and selling them a license. It's all going to happen. They're going to be producing these drugs, but under license, right? It's
already happened.
Yeah,
this is what I said. There was right now. So there was an Indian manufacturer that's licensed to manufacture the COVID-19, but no one has been turned down for a license in the entire world.
And if the Biden would like to, they could write since money, printing money has no consequences. They could print $1 trillion and hand it over to India to buy all the vaccines they want in the world. So it can be getting
part of the problem is that there are all now, well, Trump, the administration, and other countries imposed, it's called vaccine nationalism, imposed all these import restrictions, and then like when the AstraZeneca vaccine was withdrawn, the U.S. has been sitting on its stockpiles that we had and hasn't distributed them, and that was actually, they were eventually released. So there's a lot of messy controls and restrictions still in existence and still kind of causing problems, which, by the way, people are pointing to as well, this is why we need this waiver. It's like, yeah, but the waiver isn't about the controls. See, this crisis, this whole pandemic was an opportunity for us to say, we are tying our hands and tying the hands of innovators. I shouldn't say we're tying the governments are tying the hands of innovators. Mm-hmm. We should get rid of the certificates of need to build new hospitals. We should get rid of the restrictions on PPE. We should institute all of the emergency exemptions from FDA regulatory overview and do challenge trials. This was our opportunity to really show how innovators are the heroes. They are the people responsible for saving us. And instead, the governments are raking them over the coals and saying, you're responsible for the lack of, quote, equitable distribution, that's the term that's used, of this vaccine, when it's falsehood, and frankly it's morally repugnant that great heroes are being slandered in this way.
Absolutely, and it's par for the course. I mean, if the powers to be understood anything about these things, I mean, they would be opening up markets, they would be lowering tariffs to zero, they would be encouraging global trade. Instead, the conclusion from COVID is we need to build everything in the United States, right? Which is insanity and stupid. And so other tariffs are rising. That Biden is keeping them all because it fits into his statist agenda, which is
I mean, something like, I forget the exact number. I think it's 63 components of the raw materials needed to make the vaccine come from different countries.
Yep.
I mean, it's just, so that's the other thing too. It's like there's by the way, the manufacturing capacity right now worldwide for making COVID-19 vaccines is at 100%. There is no, in fact, they're not making other things because they retool manufacturing facilities to make vaccines. And so, I mean, it's just like, we can't magically like snap our fingers, like Thanos, and wish and bring into existence, all new manufacturing plants that can work at the levels at which they need to work. They need to be created, and the people who have the knowledge, the skill, the values, and the capabilities need to be there. This is just like any other, socialist plan where they say, yes, we're going to take over the plant because the workers are the ones that really created the value, and the workers take over the plant and they don't know how to run the books or how to run all the complex machinery and how to run the value chain, because the people who actually knew all that are now gone. They're now hanging from the lampposts, as happened in the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. And this is not about COVID. COVID is the virtue signal, if you will. This is the altruism that supposed we're using this for good. The real motivation here is to destroy the patent system and to destroy intellectual property more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that every single country, that India and South Africa and other countries that push for this waiver, and the people who have supported it, the politicians, were before COVID-19 were anti-patent. I mean, this is not like these aren't pro-patent people who all of a sudden woke up in February of 2020 and said, oh my God, there's a crisis, I have to set aside my commitment to patents. No, this is just a continuation of the same thing. I mean, and I wish people would call them out for that. I wish people would be identifying that fact.
So somebody's asking who specifically pushed for this. So who are the politicians, advisors? I mean, who's actually, because I think Biden is just going along for the ride. I don't think intellectually he cares one way or the other. But so who are the intellectual pushers of these ideas?
Yeah. So you mean within the U.S. to get the Biden administration to support it at the World Trade Organization? Yeah. So I mean, so there was it's your it's your usual suspects. So Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, and they activated the unions. I mean, it was really weird to have like unions lobby the federal government to support this waiver of patents. It's like, why do you care about this? But it was the whole litany of usual suspects on the left. Unfortunately, too, it was libertarians and libertarians organizations.
So the anti-P libertarians joined in on this?
Yeah. Yep. They're we're pushing for it. I don't know how much access they had to the Biden administration as such, but they helped create a cultural discourse, a frame of reference that says, oh, well, this is bipartisan. This isn't just, leftists who are opposed to this. We have so-called free market libertarians who also are pushing for this. So we should do it. So, it's just another way in which, the libertarians on the issues like intellectual property really end up helping make things worse and confusing matters.
And globally, it was primarily South Africa and India?
I mean, they were the ones that proposed it. And of course, most developing countries kind of line up typically in support of this because they've all bought into this, ideology of intellectual property constrains us and hamstrings us. And there was a whole bevy of also so-called quote public interest unquote groups and academics who in the US and worldwide who were pushing for this. There's this organization called Knowledge Ecology that is very active in organizing organizations and individuals and academics, especially in the developing world, to lobby on behalf of these matters. By the way, none of this is new. This has all happened before. This happened during the AIDS epidemic when it was at its height in the 1990s, and the U.S. stood strong and defended its innovators and its creators. And the result was we have AIDS is largely a manageable condition now.
So how did Africa get the AIDS drugs? Because they're so expensive if they maintained the patents. How did all those Africans get cured? Because they did, right? It was the pressure in the 90s was about Africa, right? Because AIDS was like crazy. How did they get it under control?
Yeah, no, I'm just laughing because that is the obvious question, right? Well, and again, like, by the way, once again, patents weren't the problem. The problem was infrastructure and distribution. And there were tons of stories of vaccines and vital medicines sitting in warehouses, distribution warehouses, rotting in Africa because the countries which are controlled by despots and other types of authoritarian regimes didn't even have the infrastructure. They don't have the roads, they don't have the distribution facilities, they don't have the freedom for people to actually get access to these vital medicines.
So you're saying the drug companies, and charities actually funded this for Africa? Because we know AIDS drugs are really expensive, right? So
I know. Well, but like, I mean, there's $10,000 in the United States because, but a person in Ghana can't spend $10,000, and their position is we're not going to get $10,000 from that person anyway. So they engage in and they use their patent rights to make sure that the drugs that they send for free to Africa or at rock bottom prices, pennies, can't be imported back into the United States. By the way, they've been attacked for this as well. But this is in a way in which, having property rights is really important. It gives them this freedom, this ability to do this, to engage in these types of activities. Because like I said, they're not going to be paid by the people in Ghana anyway, because they can't pay those monies. And so they provide it to them in the hopes that they will survive and grow and realize, hey, I was maybe they'll learn the lesson, I guess is one of the hopes, is that innovation and freedom is what has made me alive today.
So somebody, Param asks, I'm not sure if he's from India or it's an Asian currency he's paying in. So he says, why shouldn't COVID patents be removed if it can help countries like India? Assume that vaccine production does go up in the next few months because the patents are removed. Why is that a bad thing?
So why? So again, because removing patents will not increase vaccine manufacturing or distribution. It helps, the elimination of patents helps zero people. There is no evidence. I just want to emphasize, this is why I started off by saying this. There is no evidence that patents are a blockade or are preventing anyone from getting access to COVID-19 drugs or the vaccines. Now, why do you then you could say, well, then if there's no evidence, then what's the problem, right? Because then just get eliminated. Well, because then you're eliminating vital foundational property rights that are the basis for the vaccines that have been created in the first place and have been distributed. And you're eliminating the property rights that make possible the commercial agreements, the information sharing agreements. Where, as I mentioned, biotech has partnered with Pfizer. That partnership was on the foundation of patents. It's because it's property rights that serve the basis, the foundation for all commercial agreements. All agreements that are peaceful and are value producing between people are contractual agreements that are transfers of property interests. And if you eliminate property, then you eliminate the ability to have those types of peaceful, possible commercial enhancing, value enhancing contracts.
Absolutely. And you eliminate freedom. I mean, think about the slippery slope, right? Indians also need iPhones. I mean, they really need iPhones. I mean, why shouldn't we just force Apple to license its IP so the Indian manufacturer can start producing iPhones? Or India needs money. Why don't we redistribute all the money we have in the United States? Pretty rich still. Couldn't we just redistribute all the money? Once you make need the standard.
Yes. There's no end.
And you're willing to violate property rights, even if it's just this one time, right? Because the need is great. You've established a precedent that need is the standard and private property rights don't matter. You're done. You're done in terms of freedom.
And the other side has always understood this, right? I mean, Marx understood this, right? A hungry man is not free, right? And what the very first thing AOC tweeted when the Biden administration announced that it was supporting this waiver proposal is, we're going to do insulin next.
Yeah,
because there's always an emergency, right? There's always someone somewhere in the world who's not getting a drug that they quote need, unquote.
Insulin, by the way, patent expired a long time ago, so it's it's in the public domain already. But,
well, and the fact that we have massive amounts of insulin is entirely the result of this biotech innovation that was created, that was served as the foundation for the company Genentech, the very first actual company that was successful, now a multi-billion-dollar biopharmaceutical company that was created on this ability to bioengineer insulin. It's why diabetes today is not a death sentence. 30 years ago, if you were diagnosed with diabetes, that was largely a death sentence for you. Your life was now measured in decades as an adult or years as a child. It's now today an entirely manageable condition because of patents.
Yep. So we always get this question. Why is insulin so expensive?
Yeah, because patents are such the easy go-to, whipping boy, the old, term for any problem. The World Health Organization came out, before I get to insulin, I just want to mention this, and said, oh, well, the real problem in the developing world is patents. We really have to get rid of patents. By the way, they came out with a statement 3 years ago. And the current estimate is the World Health Organization has a list of the most essential medicines necessary, the medicines that treat cholera and diphtheria. 95% of them are off patent. 95% of them have zero patents on them whatsoever. So clearly patents are not the reason why these medicines are not getting to people in the developing world, which goes back to my earlier comment about lack of infrastructure and distribution in developing countries. So insulin. Great. It's a great example. It's entirely a byproduct of government regulations and controls again. So again, if you want to create a competing product to compete against insulin, you have to get FDA approval, and the FDA holds up the people and prevents people from creating competing products. There's because like I said, there's no patent. The patents, Genentech's patent on how to mass produce through bioengineering insulin expired years ago, decades ago. So it's largely a byproduct of regulatory controls, and also it's just a byproduct. And it's also in part a byproduct of that it's knowledge and know-how that makes it possible to create these things. You can't just all of a sudden say, all right, I want to create it and I'm going to do it tomorrow. I mean, this is really cutting your stuff. People don't realize these types of treatments, these types of drugs, even EpiPens, I
Yeah.
mean, this is really cutting edge technology. These are Ferraris in the biopharmaceutical context, right? And and everyone's is going. No one goes around saying, why can't a Ferrari cost the amount of a Honda or a Toyota? We all know why, right? We should be recognizing the exact same fact when it comes to medical care.
People don't need Ferraris, but they need EpiPens. And the funny thing is, EpiPen is a good example where there was a competitor, a European competitor, and the FDA wouldn't allow them. So, again, it's the barriers to entry the FDA creates, not the market creates.
And the EpiPen one is another example where, again, like patents got totally blamed for something that patents had nothing to do with. So one of the reasons why EpiPen became so expensive and became so prevalent was because Congress passed a law about 15 years ago mandating that any institution that receives federal funding has to have epinephrine available in case someone at that location has an allergic reaction. And they used in the statute the word EpiPen.
Okay.
Now, if you are a recipient of federal funds and a statute says you have to provide epinephrine, it doesn't say epinephrine, it says EpiPen, and you want to make sure you don't lose your federal funds, what's the most risk-averse thing you do? You say, buy an EpiPen. I mean, and so the federal government basically just created a massive demand for EpiPens, and what happens when you have massive demand? Prices go up. I mean, so it's just another example of just a way in which the government kind of mucked things up on top of the regulatory controls, because what Yaron said is exactly right. The FDA has also refused approval for generic quote generic unquote versions of EpiPen to be made available.
Mm-hmm. So Param is not giving up. He is from India. Yeah. He says, and in India, I'm deeply concerned because because the COVID in my country is worse than was last year. Yeah. And if patents should not be removed, how do we help countries like India to move beyond the pandemic? Well, licensing agreements, right? I mean, as you said, there's no shortage.
Yeah, I mean, so let me emphasize this again. So even before you had the explosion in the cases in India, that AstraZeneca had entered into a licensing deal with the Serum Institute of India to manufacture its vaccine. They are manufacturing the vaccine in India right now as we speak, and eliminating the patents doesn't magically produce more vaccines tomorrow to help the people who are currently sick or dying. If we had eliminated the regulatory restrictions and the trade restrictions and all the things that prevented India getting access to these vaccines before, and by the way, and if India itself had provided reliable and effective patent right protection for biopharmaceutical innovations, because they've been dragged, that country, kicking and screaming into protecting biopharmaceutical protections. They are one of the world's largest copyists of biopharmaceutical industry. India is known as the pharmacy of the world, because that's where they just mass produce lots of generic drugs. If they had actually had a system that showed that they respected these interests, so perhaps there would have been more people willing beyond just AstraZeneca to license in the country, their know-how and their knowledge and things of that sort, you would have had all of the resources already there and ready to go when you had your explosion of cases.
Absolutely. I mean, the problem in India is India. The problem in India is lack of property right protection, its lack of free markets, its lack of respect for patents, and of course the fact that you just don't have the manufacturing capabilities to produce. You've got 1 billion plus people, and you don't have enough manufacturing capabilities to produce all the vaccines. The only part of this that I'm sympathetic is the trade restrictions are restricting India from importing the vaccine. The United States seems to right now have a surplus because we've got a lot of anti-vaxxers in the U.S. who are not going to get vaccinated. So there's massive production in the U.S. that's going nowhere. You could ship it to India. It's expensive, particularly the Pfizer, because of the kind of temperatures you would have to hold it. But you could ship it to India. You could fly it to India. That is not happening because of ridiculous trade restrictions that exist all over the world. So if you want to complain about something, complain about the trade issues. And complain about your own government not providing the kind of property right protections that you would need in order to ramp up production.
And I want to also emphasize that, this is always the problem with, well, this is an emergency. We'll eliminate the rights in this instance to immediately address this problem. So let's say, assume like this would magically lead to people getting vaccines tomorrow, which it wouldn't in India. But as Your Honor and I talked about, there's always an emergency somewhere. And the signal that you just sent to every producer and innovator is the moment that we have pushed enough by someone that there is an emergency need somewhere, that their rights will no longer be respected. Their response is, understandably, I'm not going to produce it. Why should I spend over $2.5 billion, 10 to 15 years of tens of thousands of innovative, productive hours, trying to come up with cures for hepatitis, treatments for diabetes. These are, by the way, now manageable conditions that were death sentences, if they're just going to be stolen from me the moment someone, quote, needs it, unquote.
So, yes. And the other thing is, when we say that Moderna developed this in 2 days and Pfizer or the guys in Germany actually developed it in 2 hours, what we're ignoring is the fact that both companies, I mean, the German company's been around for 5-6 years, but the same couple had another company that was doing mRNA, which they sold for $1 billion something. Both Turkish immigrants. I always find that amusing. But you're ignoring the decades of work that led up to making it possible to do it in 2 hours. And all of that work depended on the idea that once they discovered something, it would be patentable and they could make money. The way they sold their previous company was because somebody bought them assuming their drugs were patentable and they could make money off of it over time. You destroy the entire system once you destroy patents.
Yes, what Yaron said is exactly 100% correct, and I'm really glad that he emphasized that, because when we talk about how the patent system made possible this unprecedented human achievement in history, has never happened before in a pandemic or in any other context. Even vaccines typically have taken up to 4 years to develop. That it's all on the foundation of what happened over the past 3 or 4 decades, when the U.S. took a moral and legal leadership role in the world, and the rest of the world followed us, some of them kicking and screaming, as I mentioned, to protecting biotech innovators, and saying, you invest your incredibly innovative, productive labors to come up with these incredible achievements that just make modern human life a miracle by any historical standard, and I mean historical standards of 20 years ago.
Oh yeah.
That you will be protecting it. You will have a property right in it, which, by the way, is also a unique American achievement. We were the first country in 1790 that did this with the first Patent Act that said these are property rights, not monopoly grants. And it's that foundation that led to people making billions and billions and billions of dollars of investments, but also companies engaging in all of these massive licensing deals and knowledge sharing agreements and everything of this sort. There's a tendency to think in people often frame pharmaceutical companies as being like monopolists, is because, they do everything themselves. It's not true. There's massive amounts of cross licensing. They embrace division of labor and specialization just as much as the high tech industry does and other sectors of the economy do, because it maximizes value creation, and it's all possible on the foundations of property rights. This is Adam Smith's insight in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Property rights allow for specialization and division of labor, by people creating massive disaggregated manufacturing chains, supply chains, distribution chains, what I call the value chain, because that's what you're ultimately producing at the end of the day.
Yep. And you can see that in the Pfizer BioNTech deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
BioNTech did the science, but they couldn't scale. They're too small. Pfizer can scale. Pfizer's a global company. It can scale easily. It's got manufacturing. It's got the ability. It can do trials. It can do all that. Beautiful division of labor, team up together, and massive manufacturing.
And this is actually, by the way, the dominant business model for many companies within the biopharmaceutical industry for the past 10 or 20 years, is you have small startups that have the ability to obtain venture capital financing, by the way, only because of their patents, as everyone witnesses every week on Shark Tank. And then they come up with an incredible innovation, but they can't scale. And so they immediately get bought or enter into a licensing agreement with a larger company like Merck or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, which has already the existing manufacturing capabilities in other instances, but even then they don't always do it. So for instance, Merck right now is manufacturing Johnson & Johnson vaccines, and Novartis, I believe, is manufacturing Pfizer vaccines. I mean, there's tons of, and this is very, very common. This isn't even something that they're just doing in the context of the pandemic, although it's been heightened more because of it.
I was going to ask you, so, and I don't know if you know a lot about this, but so during the pandemic, one of the claims that was being made was that there were actually lots of really good drugs that'll treat COVID really well, but the pharmaceutical industry is not allowing them to be approved for COVID use because they're off patent. Yeah. So the whatever it was called, whatever. Now there's the Invermycin, which I think there's still research looking at it. It looks, from what I've seen, might be good, but so the pharmaceutical companies lobbying Congress lobbying the FDA not to approve these things so that they can get their patented drugs and make $1 gazillion off of that. And the same with vaccines. Do you have any view on that?
To be frank, I haven't been following the details of these particular conspiracy theories that closely in this context, but I have heard it for years that the pharmaceutical industry is sitting on the cure for cancer and it just won't release it because it makes too much money off of its patents on chemo. And it just wants to keep doing that. And it just, again, like the
oil industry has a perpetual motion machine, and they won't release it because they want to encourage your dependence on oil.
I mean, it's just, and invariably, like there was always one company that did something bad in terms of lobbying a person for a bad reason that they point to as their kernel of truth, which is always what drives conspiracy theories, that there's the one company that maybe chose wrongly and should be called out for that. But yeah, the industry is not sitting on cures. It's not sitting on things that, because we're going to make more money off of treating the symptoms of the cure as opposed to the cure. I mean, this is moon landing conspiracy type stuff, because if you'd have to think about the millions of people that would have to be kept secret, that would have to keep that secret or being paid off if all of this was true, it would be
well, and the lost revenue. I mean, if they had to cure for cancer.
No, exactly. They would make more money. I mean, than they would ever imagine. Well, but not if they're signaled that now I wouldn't blame them to sit on their cures if the governments are going to say, come up with a cure, and
we'll take it from
guarantee is we're going to take it away from you. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, the actual drug that is used when you're on the verge of dying with COVID, when lungs are, and they give you this powerful, I think it's a steroid, that is a anti-inflammatory, and that has saved countless lives, I think. Off patent, costs almost nothing. It's a drug that's being used for many other diseases, and it works, and it's standard practice at all the hospitals now, and they're giving it. If the conspiracy theory was real, then why did the drug companies allow that to happen? I mean, I'm sure they have a response, because that's the tinfoil hat people. Well, once you get into the arbitrary, you always have a reason for an explanation for why they allowed that one to make it seem like they weren't allowing the other ones or something. Absolutely. But it just, people today have really lost a sense of how incredible the achievement of the biopharmaceutical industry is. I mean, like I said, these people are heroes. I mean, the drugs that we now take as, cheaply, daily, that are, that we don't think twice about, right? All of them are first of all, many of them are less than several decades old, but every single major drug is less than a century old. The story that I often tell in some of my talks and in my writings is, so President Coolidge's teenage son died in 1924 because he injured his little toe playing tennis on the front lawn of the White House, and he got a blood infection, and he died in a week. Wow! Because
the antibiotic that is now standard practice, that just no one thinks twice in getting from, you can get it over the counter and tubes and stuff, hadn't been invented yet. In fact, no antibiotics existed yet in 1924. Penicillin was discovered in the late 1920s, and it didn't even get worldwide distribution because Fleming refused to patent it, so no one really knew about it. So, and there was no commercial mechanism to distribute it. So actually, it didn't really get worldwide usage until World War II. And so, I mean, that's less than a century ago that the president's teenage son died from a blood infection, a staph infection, that today is just like no one dies from because it's totally treatable.
People have no sense of how good their lives are today and who's responsible for it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we still call them robber barons.
Mm-hmm.
We still hate the pharmaceutical industry. Now it's big tech is the devil. Right. Mm-hmm. And, but we all complain about them on our iPhones, on Facebook, using Intel chips and it's just in a Microsoft browser. It's just unbelievable how much people take for granted and don't think. I mean, that's the real thing. There's no thinking going on.
Yeah.
Right, let's take some of these super chat questions. Let me just see. No, well, let's stick one more question on the pharmaceutical industry. Then I want to go to price controls. We talked about this a little before, and then there's some more general IP questions here that we'll take those. So what's your view? I don't know if you followed this, but what's your view of Martin
Shkreli?
Shkreli, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
What explains the cost he was charging, and was he really cornering the market?
Yeah, I don't know the exact 100% details enough to know, other than the fact that from what I understand, he's in prison for engaging in fraud. And so, I mean, that's all I think you need to know enough about him. But apparently he bought the trademark to a drug, not the patent, I don't think, but the trademark, and wanted to charge like $1 million for it. And everyone screamed bloody murder. And again,
so there's this phenomena of people buying up old drugs where there's no competition, dramatically increasing the prices on it. And since there's no competition, they can get away with it. Typically, these drugs are out of patent, but they might just be, because they might be small markets or whatever, and there's no competition for it. And people complain that this is the evil, this is capitalism. This is horrific. How can that happen? So why is there no competition should be the answer that comes to your mind. And
that's actually, yes.
Always is FDA.
Yeah.
People can do that. They could drive the price way up.
Yeah.
But that would provide incentive for competition to enter. And what's preventing the competition is almost always, it's not the patent. It's almost always the FDA.
Yeah, Yaron's makes exactly the right point, and is that anytime that there is an incentive for someone to charge $1 million for a pill that right now is zero, right? Then you have to think, well, what's the reason for why that's occurring? Because then someone would immediately rush in and charge $900, and another person would immediately rush in and charge $1,000 or $700, and this is why your quote predatory pricing is just wrong. It just doesn't exist. And even the antitrust authorities, I think, have finally come around to recognizing that they can't find it in the real world. It's just this theoretical boogeyman. But this works in this context because you do have this massive barrier to entry in the healthcare market, and that is the FDA. Exactly.
So one thing, it seems like Democrats and Republicans agree, and that is the drug prices are, quote, too high in the United States, and the government needs to do something about it. Trump signed, it seems like, several executive orders trying to deal with this so-called problem. Now the Democrats have the House and the Senate, and they probably have a few Republican senators who would support this, given Trump's history. What is coming down the pipe in terms of price controls of drugs and trying to cap prices on drugs in the United States?
So it's a great question, because this development with the waiver is not the only attack on patents on medical innovation, and it's and there have been unending series over the past several years of proposals of to impose direct price controls, to confiscate patents, to impose what's called compulsory licensing as an indirect way to impose price controls. So the government then licenses people to compete, to produce competing products, which will push down the price of a product in the marketplace. And it's really great when you're a generic and you didn't have to actually spend 2.6 billion to create a drug, so you have no cost to make up for. You can just quickly make it at marginal cost, which is just a couple cents. And so there are several bills that are pending in Congress, that have been pending in Congress, to do all of these different things. The current bill that kind of is really being pushed right now, and the one that was endorsed and actually attempted to be put into policy by Trump through executive order, is this idea that all of the drugs that are purchased by the government through Medicare, and Medicare and Medicaid now account for well over 50% of healthcare purchases in this country now. That these prices are too high in quotes, and so the Nancy Pelosi has introduced the bill that goes by the wonderfully catchy name HR 3 for House Resolution 3. Excuse me. Trump's executive order was most favored nation. I don't know why he called it that, but essentially it requires the federal government to only pay the prices set in the other G7 countries for that, what their countries pay for drugs. Well, all of those countries have nationalized, socialized healthcare systems where the government pays what the government chooses to pay. and so this would import price controls right into the United States without actually having to call it price controls. Well, we're just Nancy Pelosi's name for it is the International Price Index, so IPI, or International Reference Pricing. And as I said, Trump called it most favored nation pricing. But essentially, this would directly import price controls in the United States. And the Democrats are pushing to have this enacted into legislation by June as part of another COVID relief package as well.
So what would be the consequences of Medicare and Medicaid buying drugs in the United States at the same prices as the European Union and Canada?
Well, the consequence will be a complete collapse in the ability of the biopharmaceutical industry to continue to fund the types of innovative and life-saving research and development that they've been engaging in. As I mentioned, in 2018, 139 billion alone just that year in private sector investments. And we are the last country standing. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why drugs are so expensive in the United States. It's called cost shifting, right? So England,
it's subsidizing. America is subsidizing the rest of the world's drugs.
Yeah. Right? And Trump explicitly said that when he announced his executive order. We are, other countries are riding on our back. So what's my solution? To adopt the same poison, not to insist on them, put pressure on them,
exactly,
charge higher price, to charge higher, to pay more for the drugs, but to actually to ride off their socialized backs. Yeah, it's just and
what would happen to prices for non-Medicare and Medicaid, so privately insured Americans?
I'm sorry.
I mean, those drug prices will go through the roof.
Well, those again too, right?
I mean, I'm luckily almost on Medicare, right? I'm this close, right? So I'll get the cheap drugs, but everybody else is going to have to pay huge, premiums in order to subsidize the drug for Medicaid.
Yeah, because the cross subsidization is not just working internationally; it works domestically. I mean, and anyone who knows anything about why we pay so much in hospital care and things like this knows this, is that because even Medicare and Medicaid is not paying really what it costs to provide medical services, and the hospitals have to make up the money some way or other. So they shift the extra cost to people who do pay,
which is going on for decades, right?
Us, right? This has been happening for decades, and it's just been accelerating as there's been pressure to push down prices paid by so-called quote public authorities, and they have to increase prices even more. And then you have all the other kind of complicating factors like controls on interstate insurance. So so you can't, there's no free competition in the insurance market. The insurance is completely controlled in the same way that drugs are controlled by the FDA. And so, and it's just, and once more, like you have just massive controls at the international level, at the domestic federal level, at the state level. And then what gets blamed? Patents.
and whatever freedom we still have.
And whatever freedom we, exactly. And
whatever freedom, like charging market prices, right? Whatever freedom we have is always to blame. It's always
to blame. Yeah. And again, just another instance of how kind of initial government controls breed more government controls. And it's just, this happens again and again and again. And we witnessed the results of this historically, and we know philosophically what the results will be, right? We witnessed just recently again in Venezuela, once the most prosperous country in South America, right? Where malaria is now running rampant there. People are dying of malaria again, which they hadn't. The malaria deaths were almost zero. Yeah, because they can't, because they adopted socialist policies and price controls, and they have, even electricity and food is scarce. And I think what's their inflation rate now? 25,000% or something like that.
It changes so quickly and so frequently, it's hard to even keep track.
I know. I mean, and it's just, and we don't, and it's just because, this isn't an accident. Everyone treats this as kind of an historical happenstance. Oh, well, that was the Soviet Union, or that was Venezuela. And we have to finally recognize the philosophical principles that tell us that this is actually a necessary result of not recognizing and respecting freedom.
So here's another question on drugs, I think. Why shouldn't drug distribution based on equity be our highest concern? Why should someone in India die for an American to live, an Algerian die for someone in India to live, someone in Antarctica die for an Algerian to live? There's nobody in Antarctica. I hate to break it to you, Brian. There's nobody in Antarctica to die. Otherwise, great. I'm kidding.
I think there are a few scientists down there, maybe some penguins.
A few scientists. Yeah, they were in isolation before COVID, so that now that I don't think COVID made it to Antarctica. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say I would push. It's a false alternative. It's a false choice. And it's only government controls and government restrictions that create that choice. Where you have that choice exist, it's because of artificial controls that have been imposed upon societies. Because society actually is people coming together to produce value between each other through agreements and living their lives to flourish and to explode, which is what we've seen in the past 2 centuries, where we have 8.5 billion people living now, and there are more cell phones in the world than there are actual people. Mm-hmm. People have more access to cell phones than they do potable water in this world now. And it's just, and so, death, by the way, for most of human history, death was the constant, right? It's because of freedom, it's because of capitalism, it's because of recognizing property rights and the security of life, liberty, and property, and leaving the individuals free to live their lives, that we've made possible for people not to have to face that choice on a day-to-day basis. And it's only in emergencies like pandemics that this choice is brought up again.
Yeah, and it's such a false premise, right?
Yeah.
Many more millions of people would be dying in India right now, if not for the benefits produced by technology, by the Green Revolution, which was the agricultural revolution in the 1960s, that all came from the science and technology created by companies in patent-respecting countries. So in that sense, every day somebody in India is alive because of what we do in America, what we did in America, right? The world is a far better place because of win-win relationships and trade, and the fact that property rights and patent rights are respected in some places. So the whole approach should be, the whole way of looking at this is the other way around. The world is so much better off. And the only thing that holding back poor countries in the world is not embracing all the things that make you rich. And the things that make you rich are property rights and a certain attitude towards wealth, and a politics of liberty, a politics of freedom.
Yeah.
So no, it's not, they're not dying because of anybody in the United States. It's not a trade like that. They're living because of stuff that was created through freedom.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to some of the more theoretical, well, this is just this one's not so theoretical, but just an example. The Human Genome Project was going to get insane federal funding, and did actually. And suddenly Craig Venter privately used a new innovation to sequence the human genome. So he did it in far less time and far less money than the government-funded project.
Yeah.
You know, the person who wrote this says the academic community still hates him and blocks his Nobel Prize. I don't know about that. I mean, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I heard also Greg Venter is not an easy guy to get along with. So I'm sure he's made a lot of enemies along the way. But yeah, he's a genius. And what he did with sequencing the human genome privately is truly stunning. Truly stunning.
I mean, he started it. So, I mean, the story is he started at NIH, and it was an NIH funded program to sequence the human genome. And he came up, and they were in, like all government programs, it was taking much longer and doing far less than what it was supposed to do. And he came up with a new method of doing it. And he came up with it on his own. And he said, I'm going to get a patent on this. And NIH said, no, you're not. You work for us. And he said, all right, then goodbye. I'm going to go form my own company, Celera Genomics. And we have the human genome sequenced because of him. And I want to say that, you know, and the human genome was sequenced in the 1990s, and they thought at that time, like there were they thought that there was a 1-to-1 correlation between genes and particular medical conditions. And so they really felt like what was going to happen once we sequenced the genome is that we were going to instantly have like massive cures for cancer and all sorts of things. And what they discovered is it's a lot more complex than what they originally imagined and thought of. And this is what makes mRNA technology so amazing, because actually mRNA technology, which is technology that was produced and created and made possible by the patents and the biotech industry, it promises the revolution that we had with the mapping of the genome. They are already using this mRNA technology to create a vaccine for AIDS and to create a vaccine for malaria. I mean,
malaria would save hundreds of thousands of lives a year.
Yes, right. I mean, and it's just like, you know, in India, you know, the people who die from malaria, right? I mean, and the people who die from diphtheria and cholera and all these other conditions, right? Which, by the way, are not the treatments for these conditions. There's no cures for them, but the conditions for them are off patent, right? That if that would be life changing, just as much as the biotech revolution has already been life changing.
So, what's the argument for why patent removal won't harm innovation?
Yeah. So
put on your libertarian.
So there's one of the reactions. So there's a couple. There's one that's kind of got purely pragmatic reaction that it won't harm innovation, which was like the reaction we had. The CEO of Moderna, his initial statement was, "I'm not going to lose any sleep over this," he said, because of the practical problems that I mentioned. How like it's going to take forever for the WTO to finally to bring everyone in line, because the WTO works by consensus. So they have to get Germany and Switzerland to agree to this, and which they eventually will, because the US will drag them into doing it, because Canada's going to flip and all these other countries are going to flip. And then by the time all of this happens, there's going to be so many vaccines available around the world. He's like, no one will care about this anymore. And that's a wrong reaction, because the ideas that drove this are still there, and the message to innovators is certainly now there, and so the damage is certainly going to happen. And then there's the arguments, the kind of more theoretical arguments. Well, that these are monopolies, that patents are monopoly grants. They're unnecessary. There's alternative mechanisms for creating innovation. And, people want Nobel Prizes. People, we can do government funding. We can do tax incentives and subsidies. There's all of these alternative mechanisms for incentivizing people to invent. And because people think in their heads, patents are only about incentivizing to invent, that people have this kind of false framing. They think patents are this little monopoly carrot that you dangle in front of people who are like mice, who just need to be incentivized like cheese to take the action to get to invent. And then once they've done, the patent system is done. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the patent system, which is what they're framing it as. And libertarians do the same thing, is the way the patents were understood 300 or 400 years ago, when they were monopoly grants from kings and queens and other governments. They're property rights. And so it's not just, I mean, sure, and property rights incentivize people to produce. The farmer will spend a year, laboring and tilling the soil and killing the bugs and fertilizing and watering to then, harvest, to reap the harvest and to sell the products in the marketplace. And the farmer won't do that if they're not promised the property right and the fruits of his labors. And the pharmaceutical innovators and biotech and high-tech innovators too, you need this in the high-tech industry are the same way. But more importantly than that, they're property rights. The farmer has property rights in his crops that he can then choose to engage in a contract with a wholesaler so he can continue to spend his time farming. So another guy can take his crops to the factory that turns the crops into bread, and they can then send it to another wholesaler who can then send it to Giant. And this is exactly what happens in the innovation side of the economy with biotech innovators and high-tech innovators and others, that the property rights serve as the basis for them to come up with business models, commercial agreements, and to engage with other people in commercial agreements that actually maximize the value and get it actually into the hands of consumers and producers and patients at the end of the day as products that are bought and sold in the marketplace.
So how do the libertarians argue against that, right? I mean, it seems like it plays right into their emphasis in economics and markets and pricing. But of course, it assumes the government, which they hate. They hate the idea of government. So what is it? What is their argument on how this would happen without a patent system?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not reducible to any one argument. But a lot of what the libertarian opposition to intellectual property, at least at the theoretical level, comes from, is a kind of very what as objectives called rationalistic argument, where they have a theory about property rights. That is a response to what economists call scarcity, and so property rights are the means by which we decide how people will use scarce resources so they're not fighting with each other. And then they deduce from that, if something is not scarce, like a new technology that can be copied, ergo it's not sufficient properly falls within the product, the need for having property rights in it. What they of course miss out on is the fact that first of all, scarcity is not the foundation of property. It's value production, which is the foundation of property, because scarcity assumes the existence of values. And one always has to ask, well, where did these valued resources come from in the first place? No one was fighting over the oil that was literally seeping up from the soil in Pennsylvania in 1810. It wasn't a scarce resource then. What made it a scarce resource is that innovators realized we can use this to create machinery and run the Industrial Revolution. And also they miss out on another very important fundamental fact. The most scarce resource in the world is the human mind, because the time that I spent coming up with an invention was time that I was unable to spend up doing something else, creating another value. And if you've stolen that invention from me, you've stolen my life from me, the part of my life that I spent working on that. And so it's a real theoretically confused understanding of what makes property is why they actually are opposed to intellectual property.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a great answer. Can you share some examples of how the lack of IP protections has led to stagnation or regression?
Oh, yes. Oh, I mean, there's tons. In fact, so this is one of the, one often hears there's no evidence of a connection between patents and economic growth and innovation. That's absolutely false. I mean, again and again and again, the same types of studies and historical evidence we point to about property rights in land and property rights in corporate assets and things like that that are connected to economic growth and flourishing societies. You find the same type of evidence between the connection between patents and other intellectual property rights and economic growth. There's a really great short essay called Patents and the Wealth of Nations by Stanford political scientist Stephen Haber. He just summarizes this in about 25 pages. It's really great. If you Google it, you'll find it really easily. It's on the internet. So I mentioned it earlier. So people often point to Fleming's refusal to get a patent on penicillin as, so he bequeathed penicillin to the world and we were all better for it. The exact opposite is what happened. And it's is that patents, because they're property rights, you get a very formal technical legal document. It's called a patent. It serves the same function as a title deed in land. It's publicly available. All title deeds are in the county recording office or some other government office that anyone can go to and look, and people do. When you buy a new house, you have a title search done, which is where they're looking through all the titles to make sure that the person who's selling to you has the right to sell it to you. All patents are public, because title deeds should be public. This is what facilitates commercialization. This is what, because people have to see your title deed, your document, to know if you actually own it. And so researchers and companies read patents all the time, and it's called pre-clearance policies. Every company does this. Almost every company. Some companies refuse to do it because they, like Google, because they have the position that patents are a blockade, but that's a policy decision, not an economic decision. But and so Fleming's refusal to get a patent on penicillin is largely recognized as delaying the introduction of penicillin, because penicillin was largely unknown until World War II, until there was a massive war and governments needed something to treat soldiers and prevent disease from killing soldiers on the battlefield, which historically has been the largest cause of deaths in war, is not being killed on battle, but being killed by disease and festering in your wounds. And even then, after World War II, penicillin was still not widely available until a patent was obtained on a new method of manufacturing it. And I'm blanking on the name of the innovator. When patent issued, I believe, in 1945 or 1946. And this is the patent that everyone points to as the patent that's responsible, that led to the mass production of penicillin and the mass introduction of it into the healthcare market for civilians.
Example. It's a great story.
I mean, but there's tons of others. I don't know if you want to move to another question, or
we can do one more, and then we'll take this other question.
Yeah. So I'll just give one kind of general example, which is really, which is another really prominent, well-known one. So in the United States, there's a piece of legislation called the Bi-Dole Act, and the Bi-Dole Act was enacted in 1980, and its sole function was to say, if you received any government funding as a scientist or a research institution, if that leads to a patentable invention, you can get a patent on it and you can own the patent. And this has been widely recognized as an extremely important piece of legislation. And the reason why they had to do this was because people were uncertain about what was the property status of all of these innovations that were being created in university research labs and at research institutions. And they were metaphorically sitting on the shelf. I mean, medical cures were sitting on the shelf. No one wanted to touch them because no one knew what the status of the title was. And so Congress actually held hearings and heard about all of these instances of medical cures where there was maybe a small amount of public funding at some point along the research process that led to it, and no one wanted to touch it because no one wanted to make the massive commercial investments and engage in the commercial negotiations because no one owned it, because there was no property rights in it. And Bi-Dole is recognized universally as leading to massive development of new medical cures and the massive licensing of these medicines from universities. And by the way, we all use a byproduct of Bi-Dole, Google.
Yep, absolutely.
Google actually, and people don't realize this, Stanford University has made $300 million off of Google, because Sergey Brin and Larry Page don't like to talk about this, but they got a patent in 1998 on their PageRank search algorithm. And because they were graduate students at Stanford actually owned it. And so Stanford gave them the right to then do a spinoff. And this is why there's this whole startup spinoff culture out of universities now, is from Bi-Dole. And Stanford has received $300 million to reinvest back into research facilities, education, scholarships, and all sorts of things because of the success of the invention of two of their graduate students.
Yeah, I mean, Stanford is the gold standard, I think, among universities in terms of licensing. And there's still, I think, in spite of Bi-Dole, there's still universities who, because of inertia and because of being inefficient, are sitting on stuff on the shelves and hold up, licensing deals, and because they're not profit-seeking institutions. It's not an accident. Stanford and the UC system is behind because what are they going to do with 300 million? I mean, they can just write beg the legislatures for more and they'll get it. They don't have to work for $300 million. But Stanford
Exactly.
is the best in the world at
Yeah.
taking what the scientists do and turning it into actually, and allowing those scientists to turn it into actual products.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, Harvard has been fantastic in this too. I mean, it's why in part there's a lot of early biotech research, the Harvard OncoMouse, which was the very first true genetically engineered organism that the United States permitted to be patented, and the rest of the world said, no, we can't. This will lead to Frankenstein. For those who don't know, the Harvard OncoMouse was a mouse that was genetically engineered to get cancer. That's why it's called the OncoMouse. And I mean, if you're trying to do research on cancer, I mean, it's really, I mean, it helps you a lot that you're guaranteed that all of your research subjects will get cancer.
Same one, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why, I mean, there's now, I mean, effectively for a lot of cancers, if you catch them in stage 1 or stage 2, you get cured. I mean, where it didn't matter, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you got cancer, you were a goner.
Yeah, survivability rates on cancer have dropped. I mean, have increased. So
massively,
dramatically over the last 30 years. People don't know this. The only reason life expectancy has not increased significantly is because of lifestyle issues and because of because of drugs, right?
I also want to just make one quick point too, which is that a lot of people conflate also patents with kind of intellectual property more generally. And it's always important to recognize too, that just because someone doesn't get a patent doesn't mean that they're not getting intellectual property protection. And this, again, another significant achievement in the United States is that we were a forerunner in recognizing trade secrets as property rights, trademarks as property rights. And these are all different property rights that secure different types of valuable creations. And given the nature of the differences in the value, like trademark is about what we call goodwill in corporate law and in the business world. And of course, trade secrets are about inventions that can be kept secret that you can't necessarily get a patent on, like a customer list. You can't get a patent on a customer list. It's not a true invention. It's because the important point is that the government provide the relevant protections, whether we call them property or some other types of protection for the value creation, given the value you've created and the business model that you want to deploy in the marketplace, and that's the important point.
Okay, so here's a more general question about IP protection. What do you think of the status quo we have in the United States, where you can find pirated material fairly easily on the internet, but it's inconvenient and technically illegal? How do we balance IP protection with free speech?
Oh, well, that's the end of the question took a left turn.
How do
we balance IP protection with maybe technological progress or innovation, like on the internet and things like that? Because the ease of finding and committing copyright violation, in particular, listening to pirated songs or watching pirated movies on the internet is a real problem. It's a real problem. I mean, it's another reason why you often hear people complain about, oh, the length of copyright, it's so long. It's a total red herring. You talk to innovators and creators, they're like, the actual practical life of my copyright term is about 5 minutes, because that's how long it takes someone to upload a pirated copy on the internet. And then
you think there's a solution to it, given the internet age?
There is, because, the internet is no different than the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century in terms of principle, in terms of that you had an incredible technological expansion or explosion in innovation and creativity that allowed people to interact in ways that they'd never interacted with before. So, with the 19th century came creation of modern corporations, and, in the telegraph, which permitted people now to communicate instantaneously across hundreds of thousands of miles, and things of this sort. And, and what we did in the 19th century is we should have done with the internet, which is we said, look, we have the basic framework of what we call generally in the United States, the common law, the protection of property rights and rights of contract. And we should allow people to develop those protections, and the government should ensure that those protections are provided. Mm-hmm. And the problem with the internet is that when the World Wide Web was invented in '93, there was a huge this is entirely different. This is entirely new. This is entirely, this is a world in which laws shouldn't even apply. There were a lot of people running around, John Perry Barlow, the guy from the Grateful Dead, one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, wrote this Declaration of Independence for the internet, which is this, paean to how the internet's totally different and laws don't apply, any laws. And so there was a hesitancy and a resistance to extending and recognizing that intellectual property protections and contract protections and regular property protections should be extended to and applied to the internet. And unfortunately, they passed some laws that hampered the evolution and development of some of these laws. One of these is an example is the CDMA, Communications Decency Act, Section 230, as it's been interpreted by courts as a huge get out of jail free card for a lot of internet companies. And so, if they had just allowed the natural evolution of the process of the extension of these basic foundational principles to this new area of activity, then we would have had the development of technologies. We talk about them now very disdainfully because they were never fully properly deployed in the proper ways that they could have been, like digital rights management and watermarking and all of these things. Because there was a time, the programmers are culturally very much opposed to intellectual property protection because of, the whole, if you know the intellectual history, that, computer programming arose in the 60s in the Bay Area. So it was very much part of the whole hippie movement at that time. And so they're very culturally opposed to IP protection and things of that sort. And I think, we would be living in a world in which it would be manageable in the same way that it was manageable with all of these new industrial technologies of the 19th century and early technologies like electricity and other things in the early 20th century.
So how do you interpret what he's asking in terms of balance IP protection with free speech?
So there, I think he's probably talking about there's a classic kind of dichotomy that's often characterized being copyright and free speech. We have to balance the two because copyright is property right in speech. And so, so if you lock down copyright as the argument in speech, then you're violating someone else's rights of free speech to speak those words. And a lot of courts use this language. We have to balance the two. You don't get that framing in patents or in trade secrets because those areas it's about technology or business practices. I assume he's talking about this kind of framing between copyright and the First Amendment. And first of all, it's a false dichotomy. And copyright has built into it the very doctrinal protections to recognize free speech. In particular, you can't copyright abstract ideas. You can only copyright the particular kind of creative words that you've come up with. So like Harry Potter is copyrighted, but and so J.K. Rowling doesn't have a copyright on the idea of a magician kid who maybe goes to a school with other wizards. I mean, those types of novels and that idea has been around here, and I'm talking about it with you and with your own, right? And that's not because we balanced free speech against copyright there. It's just that there's just no copyright issue there. There's no copyright protections in this context. And that's the important point I think you have to recognize is that rights are not about balancing conflicting claims. You have to understand rights, if you recognize that they are actually applied in context, and they're applied to in a particular context. So a property right is applied to a value that's been created. And if you understand the purpose and context for which you're protecting that copyright, you recognize it's not in conflict with anyone else's property rights. It's about recognizing where your property right ends and someone else's property rights begin. And that's natural. That's actually to say no difference than recognizing where my body ends and your body begins. And yet we don't talk about having to balance my liberty interests against your liberty interests, although some people do, but that's, again, it's a mistaken idea.
So what do you think about fair use of some of this material online? Kind of
fair use doctrine is, it's a great question. So fair use doctrine arose originally from this idea of recognizing that copyright applies contextually and for a purpose. It wasn't called fair use. It was originally was developed by courts as an equitable doctrine as opposed to a legal doctrine. These are kind of, I'm just trying to be precise as a lawyer in the 19th century. And in fact, in the very famous decision that first kind of developed this idea, Justice Story actually talks about how, well, there's people who pirate, and he used the word piracy, there's people who pirate copyrighted works. And then there's sometimes uses that don't cross that boundary. Although if we thought of them kind of out of context, we might think of them as the same as piracy. Think of it this way. This is not an unusual idea. We apply the same idea for property rights in land. you're going down a street and you discover that, oh my God, I shouldn't have turned down this street. I should have turned down the next street. So you want to turn around. So what do we all do? We quickly pull into a driveway to turn around to in front. You've committed trespass.
Yep.
You've just trespassed on someone else's rights, but no one would sue you for that.
Yep. Yep.
And now they could, and the court, you know what the court would give them? $1 for and whenever you hear someone got $1, that's because that's the court saying, yes, your rights have been in abstract have been violated, but there's been actually no harm that's been committed. And so there was this whole recognition that there were people who sometimes used a copyrighted work in a way that wasn't commercial. It didn't interfere with the copyright owner's current business model or the way that they wanted to use their works, or it didn't interfere with actually how they actually were trying to use the work even in a non-commercial context. So there was no fundamental interference with the property right, in the same way that there were, you know, turning around in a driveway very quickly for 5 seconds doesn't fundamentally interfere with someone's property right in their land. And so this got characterized and called fair use. They conceptualized it in the 1976 Patent Act, or Copyright Act, as fair use.
And is it that is being now way too broad?
And since it's been exploded into, oh, well, yes, fair use. This is about promoting innovation and about ensuring people can be creative and about subsidizing education and about subsidizing other artists and creators as well. And so it's just been unleashed entirely from its original understanding of copyright as a property right, and that on the boundaries, there sometimes are these areas of uses that you could abstractly say are violations, which really aren't. And now it's just been unleashed and given this kind of collectivist kind of, well, it's all about balancing of rights and conflicting claims. And so we really want to choose which areas we want to support and which we don't. And also, unfortunately, there are companies in the high tech space who don't create content, who are pass-throughs like Google and Facebook and others, who pragmatically, unfortunately, have come to view things like copyright and patents as blockades to their business models, and have engaged in a lot of lobbying and strategic litigation to try to expand fair use and restrict IP rights as well, unfortunately.
So I think there's a typo in this question because it doesn't make any sense. So I think this will be the last question. Let's see. Mm-hmm. It says the novel at the time Singer sewing machine patents were part of a combine. Do you know what that refers to?
Oh yeah. So I'm actually known as the sewing machine guy.
Yes, I know that. That's why I don't understand what the hell he's talking about, because I don't.
Yeah, so I actually have. I'm probably most famous for an article called "The Rise and Fall of the First American Patent Thicket: the Sewing Machine War of the 1850s." So the sewing machine was the smartphone of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So it took about 100 years for people to invent it. And when it was finally invented, and the first practical, really fully practical, commercializable sewing machine was the Singer sewing machine, there were multiple owners of different patents on different components of it. So Elias Howe had a patent on the lock stitch, which is a key component of this way in which the eye-pointed needle interacts with a shuttle to interlock two different strings to make the stitch. And there were many other inventions that people had to invent, the flat table and the overhanging arm and all sorts of stuff. And they all started suing each other for patent infringement because no one could make a practical sewing machine without infringing someone's patent. Sure. And it was called the Sewing Machine War in the 1850s, which shows you, by the way, when we called the smartphone war of all these patent cases, this is not. There was, by the way, there was a patent war over the telegraph. There was a patent war over vulcanized rubber by Goodyear in the 1840s. There was a patent war over the light bulb. There's a patent war over the airplane. I mean, these are very common because they're resolving new technologies and the boundaries of these new property rights and how and what are these boundaries, and the courts are the way we resolve this. But anyway, so there was a patent war in the 1850s, and Grover Cleveland, one of the presidents of one of the companies that was involved in the patent war, came up with this really cool idea. He said, he got everyone together and said, hey, instead of suing each other, why don't we all, it's called a cross license. And a cross license means it's not a one-way license, like you're giving me permission to use your property. So Yaron and I enter into a cross license. I'm giving him permission to use my property, and he's giving me permission to use his property. So we are licensing each other both at the same time. He said, why don't we all get together and cross license each other so we can all get down to the business of manufacturing sewing machines and making gazillions of dollars? And the other people said, awesome idea. So they exercised their property rights. They entered into it was called the Sewing Machine Combination of 1856. That's what he's referring to, the combine. The formal title was Sewing Machine Combination. They formed a trust. It was one of the famous, or some people would consider infamous, but I think is famous trusts of the 19th century. Where they all cross-license each other. We call this mechanism, by the way, now a patent pool. Mm-hmm. Patent pools are incredible devices that facilitate the commercialization of massive amounts of technology. There are today tens of thousands of patent pools. You are unaware of them because they're all between companies, because we don't see them as consumers. So there's patent pools on LASIK eye surgery, on MPEG, on MP3, on computer hard drives, on computer RAM capabilities, on Wi-Fi. Because the fact of the matter is there's lots of people who are usually inventing different components of these. And so this was an example of how property rights, again, facilitate incredible value creation, because since patents were property rights, they were able to engage in contracts called licenses in the patent context, which is where you're giving other people the right to manufacture on your terms, or use or sell your invention. You're trading with them your property rights, just like a landowner trades property rights by allowing someone to live on their lands, and then we call that person a tenant. And patent pools were just incredible facilitator of innovation. And of course, in the 20th century, the antitrust authority said, oh, that's improper market division. That's an antitrust violation. So actually, the antitrust authority shut it down. For about 30 or 40 years, people were prohibited in the United States from entering into patent pools. And it wasn't until 1995 when a company called MPEG LA asked the Department of Justice for approval from the antitrust authorities to form a new patent pool on MPEG technology. And the antitrust authority said, well, we're going to change it from absolute prohibition to to a contextual prohibition. We'll just investigate the purposes of why you're doing it. For those who know law, it's called the rule of reason analysis, although it's not reason at all. And that led, this is why there's an explosion of patent pools again, because this is just an example of how commercialization is facilitated by patents. Patents are a launching pad for innovation. They are not blockades. They are not stifle innovation.
Okay, so in the meantime, we get two additional questions.
Awesome. I love them.
Yeah. What about copyrights on critical speech seized by authoritarian governments, which then use those copyrights, often indirectly through nominally private entities, to silence criticism? And he's thinking here of China seizing copyrights on journalism product about Tibet, for example.
I don't know the specific example of what he's talking about. I mean, I do know, so the Church of Scientology has used copyright to try to silence critics who have released their various secret books and manuals where they admit to being being a cult and things of that sort. And that's an example where people sometimes talk about that, but I haven't heard of this. I haven't heard of this instance. The problem with China isn't that they're seizing copyrights. The problem with China is that they're ignoring. They've been long ignoring the patent rights and copyrights and other intellectual property, requiring U.S. businesses who do business there to do forced tech transfer and forced transfer of their IP to Chinese companies, and then simultaneously, actually in the past 10 years, creating a very robust intellectual property system for their own innovators. Because they recognize that all of this kind of drives their own economic development. Of course, they've increasingly becoming authoritarian. They've got the Ungar concentration camps. They've shutting down they're arresting people in Hong Kong and political opposition parties. And so you can have a most robust IP system in the world, but if you're going to act like a dictatorship and authoritarian regime, that you're going to end up again like Venezuela or the Soviet Union.
Yep. Yes, their time will come.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because
I know.
Vimeo,
there was a period there where they looked hopeful. Like it looked really like
until about 3-4 years ago, it really did look hopeful.
Yeah.
And then it went all downhill. He said Vimeo pioneered online video and were nearly crushed by YouTube, who used DCMA to let people upload copyrighted shows. In practice, they take down requests cannot keep up with pirate uploads. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm having trouble understanding the question.
It is YouTube allowed
Yeah.
everybody to upload anything, and
Yeah.
people uploaded copyrighted stuff, and then the requests to take them down, YouTube just can't keep up with them.
Yeah, YouTube can't keep up with them. No one can. I mean, so the DMCA was the law that was enacted in 2000 or 1999, but it went in effect 2000. That was an attempt to try to provide some sort of IP protections on the internet, and especially in the copyright context. And of course, it was totally attacked at the time by scholars like Larry Lessig. Larry Lessig literally wrote an article called "The Death of the Internet," saying the DMCA has killed the internet. We will have no internet in 10 years. I'm not joking. You can find his article. The Death of Cyberspace, actually, it's called The Death of Cyberspace. But the DMCA allows mandates that if you are a website or internet service provider, a platform technology, we now call them, like, Facebook or YouTube, and you have copyrighted work uploaded, that copyright owner can send you a notice, and the DMCA requires you to take it down. If you don't, then you're liable for participating in the copyright infringement. And the problem is that the DMCA notice and takedown system has been construed in such a narrow way, because the internet service companies engage in a strategic litigation campaign to get it narrowed so specifically. So court said, basically, your request has to be limited to the specific file. You can't just identify the copyrighted work generally. It has to be the specific file, which, by the way, then that explains why there's millions of takedown notices, right? Because you can't just say, hey, I'm the owner of, I don't know, the Avengers movie. All Avenger movies, take them out. Every single one has to be taken down. And the problem is referred to as whack-a-mole. You take one down and 5 more pop up, because it's
then
easy.
ask for each one of the separate ones.
You can't keep up with it. Yeah. And really, companies like Google and YouTube help facilitate this, because their position to this day has been, oh, we can't develop the technology to do this, to police this. We can't identify all the Avengers, infringing works and everything that's posted. That's bogus. This is a company that finishes your search request as you're typing it into their window. Look, they're an innovative company. They did great things, but on the IP side, they've not been good, and they have helped create this problem. And then they complain about the problem, like, oh yeah, now we get all these thousands. So they use then the problem they created to help actually explain that there's still a problem. So, and to argue against IP protections on the internet continuing.
Pragmatism is killing these people.
Yeah, it really is. It's just this kind of pragmatic short term, not realizing that intellectual property is in their interests. Everyone having their property rights protected is in everyone's interests. It's the founders recognize this. It's why the Declaration of Independence says the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They weren't utilitarians. You protected people's rights, and this is what leads to a flourishing society where all individuals are happy. Individual rights.
All right, let's see. 2 more. Is it bad law that parodying music is legal? Like Weird Al. Doesn't the artist have a right to that music?
So Weird Al actually is really good in that he actually gets licenses and approvals from that's my understanding of his business model is that he actually gets approvals from the people, and people actually, and his are real silly parodies. So and he's funny at times. So they allow it. But even if he would still have, it would be considered fair use under parody if he did it. And this is one of those really complex issues in copyright law. At what point have you changed enough of a work such that it's not really copying the work, and you're addressing an entirely different context of an audience with an entirely different purpose from what the original market of that work is? And that's ideally what fair use should be asking. And it still does, but it's just been but the inquiry has been so mangled that by bad ideas and bad theories about what is copyright and what is fair use, that it's just, they don't get at it very well anymore. And so now you have the Supreme Court in Google v. Oracle saying, oh yes, Google, which undisputed directly copied over almost 11,500 lines of Java code from then Sun Microsystems and then later Oracle when it bought it, simply because Google did not want to pay for one of the 3 paid licensing options that Oracle and Sun Microsystems and Oracle, or they were offered a 4th free one. So they actually had a 4th open source free licensing option, but this was to use Java in their Android smartphone platform system. So they wanted to make it proprietary. So they couldn't take the open source one.
Yep.
So they just decided the risks of us being held liable for copyright infringement are so minimal, we're just going to take it and we'll litigate. And then for 10 years, they litigated this lawsuit and turning fair use totally on its head. The Supreme Court has said, you take someone else's copyrighted work for a commercial purpose. This was to produce the Android smartphone, to create a competing commercial product. They created a proprietary Java system that destroyed Oracle's licensing. I mean, this is undisputed. They lost billions of dollars in licensing on Java because no one would license with them anymore because they're like, oh, well, Google can steal it. I can steal it too. And they said, sure, yep, go ahead and do it. That's fair use.
But I thought this court was super pro free market, pro copyrights and patents.
If only we had the Supreme Court that all the leftists claim the Supreme Court is, we would live in such a different world.
Good. So who voted for that decision? Which conservatives voted for this decision?
So it was a decision by Justice Breyer, who, I mean, was on record as a law professor in 1972 being anti-copyright. In an article he wrote called "The Uneasy Case for Copyright," where he concluded there really isn't one. But then, and Amy Barrett didn't participate, and it was it was all the justices joined him, including Chief Justice Roberts. And Justice Gorsuch. It was the dissent was Justice Thomas, which is surprising because Justice Thomas is very anti-patent. Justice Thomas and Justice Alito dissented, so it was a 6-2 decision. And Justice Thomas actually wrote a really great dissent where he just called out all of the ways in which the opinion doesn't match up with court's precedents and makes a hash of fair use and is letting Google get away with theft. Unfortunately, one of the arguments by Breyer was, well, one of the reasons why we have to use fair use is to limit monopoly power. And Java was such a widely adopted program that Sun Systems and Oracle had monopoly power in this essential program. And here was Thomas's chance to say, this is not about monopolies, but instead he totally embraced it and doubled down and said, you're worried about monopolies? Well, Google actually is the real monopoly here.
He's become terrible. In many regards. He's changed over the last.
I know, it's unfortunate.
So here's a good way to end this, I guess.
Okay.
Going back to the original topic, will pharma companies challenge the Biden administration's patent waivers in the court? Is there even a case to be made? And would they win if they did?
All right, so that's a great question because there's a lot of confusion about what this announcement was. So the announcement was about supporting a proposal at the World Trade Organization, which is an arm of the United Nations. So this was not a proposal about anything we're doing in the US under US domestic law, at least not yet. So there's going to be this huge negotiation of exactly what is the nature of this new agreement where everyone's going to have to agree to as an international treaty at the World Trade Organization. And then every country is going to have to implement it through their own domestic laws. And so a lot will depend upon the language of what the waiver says at the World Trade Organization. And then a lot will depend upon the actual nature of the legislation that's proposed in the United States. And until we see that, it'll be very hard to understand, or to see what their claims will be. Now, they don't have a lot of claims that they can make other than they can argue under the takings clause, where if the government takes your property, it has to pay you. Notice the government can take your property, it just has to pay you if it does. So the US might provide compensation, but they don't have to provide, but the compensation doesn't have to be necessarily the true value of it. And they can argue due process. But that's also been interpreted in a way that's very narrow and limited. As long as the law is passed through the proper mechanisms and is adopted through proper procedural rules that are existing, then they won't really have a due process claim. So it'll be very hard to see what happens or to predict, but they're likely a ability to prevent a waiver from happening in the United States under US law implementing this waiver at the WTO is really probably unlikely.
That's horrible.
And it will be a disaster. And the U.S. will implement it, because how can we say to the world, we support the waiver, but we're not going to implement it in the United States? I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Thank you, Adam. This was great. Really enjoyed
Well,
it.
it was a great discussion, but unfortunately, the topic we were talking about is not great.
No.
But thank you, Yaron. You asked great questions. It was really your
A
audience
lot of
asked
the
great
questions
questions.
were from the audience. So thanks all the super chatters. Really appreciate that. Don't forget to like the show before you leave. There should be over 100. So don't forget to press that thumbs up, share the show, subscribe to the show, and don't forget to support the show on YourOwnBookShow.com/support, Patreon, and Subscribe Star. Thanks everybody. Thanks Adam. Look forward to doing this again sometime soon.
Yeah, it would be great. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks Adam. Bye. Bye everybody.